The escape pod hit the atmosphere like a stone thrown into a lake. Hard, ugly, and with zero regard for the man inside it. Lieutenant Cole Warren had 7 seconds to brace before the tree line came up and swallowed him whole. Then nothing. Then pain. He woke up with a mouthful of purple soil and 1 boot missing. The forest around him was wrong in every way a forest could be wrong. The trees grew sideways before growing up. The leaves were black on top and silver underneath, and the air smelled like copper and burnt sugar. His survival pack was still strapped to his back. His comm unit was dead. The distress beacon had a single blinking red light, which meant it was transmitting but not receiving, which meant nobody was answering. Cole had been a lieutenant in the Deep Range Survey Corps for 4 years. He had trained for crash landings on hostile worlds. He had trained for isolation protocols, for first contact scenarios, for psychological endurance in zero-stimulus environments. None of that training had included a section called What to Do When 7-foot Alien Women with Cobalt Blue Skin and No Patience Surround Your Crash Site within the first 20 minutes. But that was exactly what happened. They came out of the trees in a formation that was too organized to be curiosity. There were 6 of them, and they moved the way people moved when they had already decided something. Tall, broad-shouldered, each wearing layered armor that looked like hammered bone and dark metal woven together. Their hair, every one of them, was white. Not old person white, but ice storm white, and worn in complex braids that had small metal rings threaded through them. The rings clicked when they moved. Cole stood up. He kept his hands visible. His sidearm was still holstered, and he made a deliberate point of not touching it. The one in front stopped 3 meters away and studied him the way a mechanic studies an unfamiliar engine. Not with fear, but with the particular focused attention of someone trying to figure out what something does and whether it can be useful. She said something. The language was full of hard consonants and tones that went up at the end like questions, except they clearly were not questions. Cole said, in the calmest voice he had, "I do not understand you. I am not a threat. My ship went down. I need to repair my beacon." She looked at his hands, at his pack, at the smoking wreckage of the pod behind him. Then she said something to the women behind her, and 3 of them immediately moved toward the wreckage and began examining it with the calm efficiency of people who had seen crashed ships before. That was the first surprise. The second surprise was that the leader, Cole decided to call her the leader because she was the one doing the talking and the others were doing what she gestured toward, pulled a small flat device from her belt and held it up. It projected a soft blue light that swept across him from head to toe, paused on the comm unit strapped to his wrist, and then beeped twice. She looked at the readout. Her expression shifted by exactly 2 millimeters. On a human face, Cole might not have caught it. No, but he had spent 4 years reading alien body language in low-information situations. And what he read was, "This is not what I expected." She spoke again, slower this time, as if slowing down would help. It did not help. But the effort was interesting. Cole filed that away. "Cole Warren," he said, pointing at his chest. "Lieutenant, Survey Corps." He pointed at the sky. "My ship. Damaged." He pointed at the beacon on his pack. "I am trying to call for help." She watched his hands through the whole thing. Then she pointed at herself and said a word. Long, with a double tap of the tongue at the start. He could not reproduce it. He tried anyway. She made a sound that might have been amusement. The women behind her did not make the sound, which told him that whatever hierarchy was operating here, the open amusement at the wrong moment was not permitted. She pointed at herself again and said a shorter version of the name. Cole tried that one. Vi? The 2mm expression shift again. This time it looked like close enough. Vi gestured toward the trees, in the direction her people had come from. It was not a request. Cole looked at the wreckage. Everything salvageable was already being pulled free by the 3 women at the pod. They were fast, methodical, and careful. They set each piece down in a line without dropping anything or breaking anything, which suggested they understood the concept of fragile equipment, even if they did not know what any of it did. His options were limited. The beacon was transmitting. The survey corps would eventually triangulate his signal. Eventually could mean 3 days or 3 months, depending on how far off route the pod had drifted during the emergency burn. He had food for 6 days. After that, he needed a local solution. Vi was still watching him. Cole picked up his pack, slung it over one shoulder, and nodded. Vi turned and walked. The others fell in around Cole, not restraining him, not touching him, but positioned in a way that made clear which direction was optional and which direction was not. It was the kind of escort that said, "We are not arresting you, but we are absolutely not leaving you here either." The forest swallowed them. Cole walked and counted his steps automatically, the way he always did in new terrain, and cataloged everything he could. Gravity slightly lighter than Earth standard, maybe 92%. Air breathable, only slightly high on oxygen, which explained the copper smell and the mild buzzing behind his eyes. The trees clicked when the wind moved through them, which meant the wood was dense. The silver undersides of the leaves caught light from a sun that was lower and redder than he was used to. No animal sounds. That was interesting. Not because it was silent. There were insects, there was wind, there was the clicking of the trees and the clicking of Vi's braids. But there were no bird equivalents, no rustling from underbrush, no distant call and response. Whatever lived in this forest had learned to be quiet, or had been made quiet. They walked for 40 minutes before the trees broke and the settlement came into view. It was not what Cole had been picturing. He had been picturing something tribal, temporary, he constructed from local materials. What he saw instead was a compound. Low structures built from the same dark metal and bone composite as the armor, arranged in a precise hexagonal pattern around a central open space. The structures had no sharp corners anywhere. Everything curved. The whole thing looked grown more than built, the way certain earth corals looked grown, with the same sense of deliberate complexity achieved through repetition of a simple rule. There were more women. No men. Cole clocked that in the first 10 seconds and kept his face neutral. A crowd had gathered at the edge of the compound. Word had traveled faster than they had walked, which meant communication devices or scouts he had not spotted. The women watching him ranged from young, teenagers maybe, to very old, with the same white hair at every age, the same cobalt skin. All of them were watching him with the same mechanic studying an engine expression that Vi had worn at the crash site. No hostility, no fear. What Cole was reading, across 30 faces at once, was something closer to desperate hope, which was a far more complicated thing to walk into than hostility. Vi stopped in the center of the open space and turned to face him. She said something in a tone that had weight behind it. Formal. A declaration, not a conversation. Then she waited. Cole stood in the center of a circle of women who needed something from him, on a planet he had not planned to visit, with a dead comm unit and a beacon that might take months to raise anyone. He took a slow breath. "All right," he said, "to nobody and everybody. Let's figure this out." Vi did not sleep. Cole learned this on the first night, when he woke at what his internal clock told him was 2 in the morning and found her sitting outside the structure they had given him, cross-legged in the dirt, watching the compound entrance with the focused stillness of someone who had been doing this for a long time. He sat down next to her. She did not look at him. He did not speak. They sat in the dark for a while, listening to the clicking trees, and Cole thought about the pattern of the settlement, the absence of men, the expressions he had seen on 30 faces, and the formal speech Vi had given when they arrived. He was missing a piece, probably several pieces. In the morning, he would start finding them. Vi said something soft into the dark. Not to him. To herself, maybe. Or to the compound, or to something he could not see. The word sounded to Cole's untrained ear like a name. He filed that away too. By the third day, the translation was coming together. Not the language. That was months of work, minimum. But the gesture and object communication that intelligent species almost always fell into when they needed to bridge a gap fast. Vi had sharp instincts for it. She would hold up an object, say the word, wait for Cole to repeat it. When he pointed at something and looked at her, she would say the word and then use it in a short phrase and wait to see if he could parse the phrase from context. They built a working vocabulary of about 80 words by the end of day 3. Enough to understand the outline of the problem, if not all the details. The word Vi used most often, pointing at the settlement and then at the wider world with a sweeping gesture that included the forest and the sky and everything beyond, was a word Cole eventually mapped to something like failing. The second most used word, always paired with it, was a word he mapped to machine. On day 4, she took him to see the machine. It was underground. They accessed it through a hatch in the central structure, down a ramp that descended 30 meters into the bedrock. The temperature dropped with every step. By the time they reached the bottom, Cole could see his breath. The chamber was enormous. It stretched farther than the lights reached, which were dim and flickering in the unsteady way of a system running on backup power, where in the center of the visible space was a structure that took Cole a full minute to process. A column of interlocked components, some mechanical, some crystalline, some that appeared to be biological, rising from the floor to the ceiling 30 meters above them and extending in both directions into the dark. It was running. Barely. Cole could feel the vibration of it through the soles of his boots. Irregular, like a heartbeat with a missed beat built into it. Vi watched his face while he looked at it. He pointed at the column. What does it do? She used 4 words, 2 of which he knew. The one he didn't know she repeated twice, then walked to the column and pressed her palm flat against it. The temperature in the chamber dropped by 3 degrees in the space of a breath. The light steadied for exactly 4 seconds, and then went back to flickering. Cole stared at the column, at the condensation forming on the crystalline components, at the frost growing at the base where the machine met the floor. It controls the temperature, he said. The whole planet's temperature, or just this region. She did not understand all of that, but she understood enough to answer with a sweeping gesture word. The whole region. Cole ran the numbers in his head without meaning to. 92% gravity. High oxygen atmosphere. A red sun lower on the horizon than he was used to. If this machine had been regulating a climate zone and it was failing, the cold would come. The growing season would shorten. The food supply would compress. The compound had roughly 300 women in it. He had not seen any stored food reserves. He looked at Vi. How long? He asked, and tapped his wrist where a watch might sit. She held up both hands, fingers splayed, and then slowly closed them both at the same time. 10 units of time, 10 of something. Cole pointed at the sun through the ceiling, mimed its arc across the sky. She nodded. 10 days. The machine had 10 days before it failed completely, and when it failed, 300 women in this compound would lose their only shield against whatever came next. Vi was still watching him with that mechanic expression. Cole crouched down and opened his pack. He had a basic field engineering kit. Nothing designed for alien technology, but tools were tools. And a failing machine was a failing machine. He had fixed enough broken things in the field to know that the universal language of broken equipment was not that different from one world to the next. He looked up at Vi. "Show me where it started," he said. The problem was not one thing. That was always how it went. One thing would have been manageable. Swap a component, reroute a circuit, brace a failing joint. One thing could be fixed in an afternoon. What Cole found over the next 2 days of crawling through the guts of the machine with Vi holding a light source above his head and a young woman named Oka. Vi's apparent second in command, faster with tools than anyone Cole had ever worked with, handing him instruments as he called for them, was a cascade failure in progress. 3 primary load-bearing components had cracked into the crystalline sections, which turned out to be a material he had never encountered, dense and cold-conducting, somewhere between quartz and something organic. Had hairline fractures running through them that were spreading at a rate he could calculate from the frost patterns. The biological sections, which he still could not fully explain, but which appeared to be a kind of engineered tissue grown directly into the mechanical frame, were going necrotic at the edges. And the power routing, wherever it originated, was spiking and dropping in a pattern that was accelerating each spike. On day 6, Cole sat on the floor of the chamber with his back against the column and thought about it. Oka sat across from him, sharpening something from her belt kit that was not a knife, but functioned like one. Vi stood at the far end of the visible chamber, hands clasped behind her back, staring into the dark. They had not asked him what his plan was. They had not pressured him. They had not offered suggestions or hovered or second-guessed his assessments. They had given him access to everything, answered every question he could formulate in their shared 80-word vocabulary, and then waited. He looked at Oka. "I need a material. Cold conducting, dense. Can fractures be sealed?" Oka looked at him for a moment, then stood up and disappeared up the ramp. She came back 11 minutes later with a small container of something that looked like dark resin. She set it down in front of him and demonstrated by pressing a small amount into a hairline crack in a loose crystalline fragment she had picked up from the floor, and then pressing her fingers over it until it hardened. Cole picked it up and examined the seal. It was not the same material, but under stress, it might hold long enough. "How much of this do you have?" he asked. Oka held up 2 fingers, 2 containers. It was not enough to fix everything. It was enough to fix the right things. Cole stood up, picked up his kit, and looked at Vi across the chamber. "I have a plan," he said. "It is not a good plan, but it is the plan we have." Vi said one word. Cole had learned that word on day 1. It meant proceed. The next 4 days were the closest thing to controlled chaos Cole had ever voluntarily produced. He worked in 16-hour stretches, sleeping on a mat Vi had placed 15 meters from the column so that he could hear if the vibration pattern changed. Oka worked alongside him, learning his methods faster than he would have thought possible from someone operating without a common language. After the first day, she was anticipating his next tool request before he made it, catching his errors before they became problems. And twice she pointed at something he had assessed as stable and held up 4 fingers in a clear sign that meant 4 days. Not stable at all. Both times, She was right. The biological tissue was the hardest part. Cole had no background in xenobiology and no tools designed for it. What he eventually worked out, through 2 failed attempts and 1 near disaster that dropped the chamber temperature by 15 degrees in 4 minutes, was that the tissue responded to warmth, not heat, just warmth. And that pressing his bare hands against the necrotic edges while OK applied the resin on the mechanical side slowed the spread enough to let the seal hold. He did not think about what the tissue felt like under his hands. He thought about the vibration pattern and the frost and the math. On day 9, Vi came down the ramp and stood next to him without speaking. He was lying on his back inside the lower frame of the column, both hands pressed against the largest fracture site, while Oka worked the seal from the outside. Vi crouched down next to the opening and looked in at him. She said something he did not have a word for. Then she pointed at him and said the word again. Cole filed it for later. On day 10, at 14 hours past midnight by his internal clock, the vibration pattern changed. Not the bad kind of change. The bad change was an acceleration of the mist beat rhythm, the skip becoming a lurch, becoming a stall. What happened instead was a smoothing. The mist beat filled in. The lurch became a rhythm. The rhythm became steady. The frost at the base of the column stopped spreading. The lights in the chamber came up to full brightness for the first time since Cole had arrived. OK, who had been working next to him for 14 straight hours without a sound, made a sound. It was not a word. It was something that had been held in a long time and had run out of room. Cole sat back on his heels and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment. The column hummed, steady and full, like a thing that had remembered what it was supposed to do. Vi stood at the base of the ramp. She had not moved from that spot in 6 hours. When the lights came up, she looked at the column, then at OK, then at Cole. She crossed the chamber floor, stopped in front of him, and said something short and direct. Cole had enough vocabulary now to catch 3 of the 4 words. The 4th word was the one she had said while he was inside the column frame, the one he had not known. He knew it now. It meant necessary. He found out about the men on day 11, because the beacon finally picked up a response signal. Not a core ship, a colony relay. Someone had been listening, had bounced the signal forward, and a response had come back. 12 days to nearest survey vessel. Hold position. 12 days was fine. 12 days was survivable. Cole had stretched his food supply with what the compound provided, and Vi had at some point decided, without discussion, that he was eating with the settlement rather than from his own pack. The knowledge about the men came from a conversation that took 2 hours and most of his vocabulary and a significant number of hand drawings in the dirt, because Vi decided, also without discussion, as a simple transfer of information that had become relevant, to explain it. There had been men, not her species, a different species, from a different system, who had arrived 300 years ago and integrated into the settlement's technical operations. They had built the column. They had maintained it. They had understood it in ways that Vai's people, whose strengths ran to everything else, had not. 70 years ago, a sickness had taken them. Fast, selective, and complete. The column had run on its maintenance cycles for 70 years. The women had kept everything else functioning. But when the cascade failure started 8 months ago, they had not had the knowledge to address it. And every contact they had attempted with the outside had gone unanswered, and the situation had become the 10-day countdown that Cole had walked into from a smoking escape pod. Vi drew the last figure in the dirt, the male figure, the column, the 70-year gap. and then sat back and looked at Cole with the expression he had first read, as mechanic studying an engine. He read it differently now. It was not that expression at all. It was the expression of someone who had been carrying something alone for a long time and had not yet decided what to do with the relief of having help. Cole looked at the drawing in the dirt, at the 70-year gap represented by a long, simple line. "You've been holding this together by yourselves," he said. Vi did not understand all of it, but she understood enough. She said one word. Cole knew that word. It meant yes. The survey vessel was called the Henrietta Cross, and its captain was a compact woman named Dr. Grace Olson, who arrived 12 days later with a crew of 9, a full medical bay, and the particular manner of someone who had been in deep range long enough to be difficult to surprise. She was surprised. She stood at the edge of the compound with Cole, looking at the settlement, looking at the women, watching them from the structures and the open space, looking at Vi, standing in the center of the compound with her arms at her sides and her white braids clicking in the wind. "Your beacon report said stranded," Olson said. "I was stranded," Cole said. "It did not say any of this. There wasn't a field in the report for any of this." Olson looked at Vi. Vi looked back at Olson with the same focused assessment she had turned on Cole at the crash site. Olson, to her credit, met it evenly. "How long before you could leave?" Olson asked. Cole thought about the column, about the resin seals that would need inspection every 30 days, about the biological tissue that responded to warmth and the cascade pattern that would restart if anyone forgot to check the frost at the base. "I could leave now," he said. "That the immediate problem is solved." But 12 days ago they had nobody who understood the machine keeping them alive. "The fix I put in is a patch, not a solution. If something else fails, they're back to a countdown." Olson looked at him sideways. "You want to stay?" "I want to make sure they don't end up back at day 10 in 6 months." Olson was quiet for a moment. "The Corps doesn't have a protocol for this. The Corps doesn't have a protocol for most of what actually happens out here," Cole said. "That's sort of the whole job." Olson almost smiled. She crossed the open space toward Vi, and Cole watched her introduce herself, point at chest, say name, the same gesture he had used 13 days ago, and watched Vi receive it with the same precise 2mm expression shift that meant, "Not what I expected." OK appeared at Vi's shoulder, looked at Olson, looked at Cole, and said something that included the word Cole had learned on day 9. "Necessary." Olson looked back at Cole. "What did she say?" "She said I'm necessary," Cole said, which, coming from her, is about the highest compliment available. The column hummed 60 meters below their feet. Steady. The frost was gone. The lights in the compound burned full and clean. Vi looked at Cole across the open space and said 2 words. He knew both of them. The first one meant stay. The second one meant teach. Cole Warren, lieutenant of the Deep Range Survey Corps. 1 boot still missing, with a patch job holding together an alien climate engine and a 12-word spoken vocabulary in a language that did not have a known designation in any Corps database. Looked at the compound he had spent 13 days in, at the 300 women who had watched him with desperate hope and then given him every tool they had. At OK, already walking back toward the column hatch. At Vi, waiting for his answer with a patience that had nothing of begging in it and everything of certainty. He looked at Captain Olson. "Put in the paperwork," he said. "Extended survey assignment. Indigenous technology preservation. Undocumented system." Olson sighed like a woman who had known this was coming since the moment she landed. "You're going to make my reporting forms very long," she said. "That's the job," Cole said, and went to find his other boot.